Hello and welcome back to Tanya. So we're on the topic of the technique of basically breaking down the evil inside of one, because we all have deep inside good, and sometimes the evil can cover over that good, and sometimes the only way to bring that good to the surface is by crushing the evil. And we learned about different things to think about to crush oneself in order to crush the evil. And that was in the previous chapter. Now we're going to continue on the string of thought, and this actually leads us to understand another thing, which is why it is so wrong to look down upon others that are not as religious as we are, which sadly is something that people tend to do, to put themselves up and bring others down. And we're going to explain exactly why that is so wrong. Perek Lamed, chapter 30. Od zot yasim libo lekayim amar Razal ve'vishafat ruach b'fnei kol ha'adam. Another thing is that you should pay attention to fulfill the saying of our sages of blessed memory, to be very humble before every person. That's from Ethics of Our Fathers. So the Tanya adds a few words into there, and be very truly humble in front of everyone, literally even in front of the religiously irreverent people. Even somebody who's like completely, as you'd call it, not religious. One should be humble in front of them. Why? כי מקום גורם לו לחטוא, להיות פרנסת או ללך בשוק כל היום, ולהיות ביוש וקרנות ואין עברות כל התאוות. Because, I actually skipped a line. Let me go back, sorry. והיינו על פי מים החז"ל אל תדין את חברך עד שתגיע למקומו. That it will be accomplished. Being humble in front of somebody that's quote unquote not religious will be accomplished through fulfilling the saying of our sages in another place. Don't judge your friend until you reach their place. Okay, so accomplishing that, not judging someone until you reach their place, is the key to being humble in front of them. Okay, how does this work? Let's explain a little bit. כי מקום הגורם לא לחטוא, להיות פרנסת או ללך בשוק כל היום ולהיות מיושבי קרנות ואין עברות כל התאוות. Because why should you not judge somebody until you reach the place that they're in? It is because the place that they're in is what causes them to sin. They're in an environment that warrants sin. Being, let's say, for example, as it says over here, his sustenance, so where he works to make a living, is in the marketplace, that he spends the whole day there, and he sits in the corners of the streets, and his eyes see all desires. He's working in the middle of let's say modern day vernacular, the middle of a big city full of non-kosher restaurants, full of all kinds of not moral things around him, for example. I don't have to go into the details. But he's in a place that it makes it difficult for him not to sin. So he's around these things. So what happens is, and this is very famous actually, is that the eye sees and then the heart desires. So when his eyes see these kind of immoral things, then his heart desires them. So it's difficult for him. And what happens then is his inclination inside of him, his desire for these kind of evil things, burns like a baker's oven, a fiery baker's oven. As it says in the verse in Hosea, that he is burning like a flaming fire. That is that guy that is in a whole different place than you're in. You, for example, or by contrast, somebody that is not like that, somebody that just goes to the market a little bit, and the majority of the day he's sitting at home, so he doesn't see immoral kind of things. So that already is a reason not to judge him. Don't judge him, because he has a much more difficult challenge. He has to deal with a very burning desire for evil things, as opposed to you, who don't have such a desire, because you're not in the same situation as he is in. Okay, very good. But what if I am in the same exact situation? What if I do go to the marketplace the whole day, and I'm quote unquote more religious than he is? Then can I judge him? So he continues. Even if you do go to the market the whole day and you find yourself to be more religious, still it's not an excuse to judge him. Because it could be that you are not so heated in your nature. Because the inclination inside of us, the desire, is not equal in everybody. Some people have a burning evil inclination, and some people have a much less of a burning evil inclination. I believe we touched on this in chapter 15, if I'm not mistaken. We said that there are some people who naturally have a very difficult time with their heart. Either they have a stronger desires for certain things, or they get angry easier, and so on and so forth, than others. So yes, maybe you and your colleague are in the same atmosphere the entire day, and you're more religious than him, but it doesn't give you a right to judge him. It could be that naturally it is much easier for you to control your impulses. And for him, he has a much harder time doing that. It's very possible. והנה באמת, גם מי שהוא מחומם מאוד בטבעו, בהכנסתו להיות מיושבי קרנות כל היום, אין לו שום התנצלות על חטאיו, ומכריחה שגמור על אשר אין פחד אלוהים לנגד עיניו. So now, this is very important over here. We're not giving a excuse for somebody to go ahead and start sinning. Because really, in the words of the Tanya, even somebody who has a very difficult time with his impulses, and he's very heated up naturally, and his life sustenance, his work is to sit in the corners of the streets the whole day, even someone like that does not have an excuse to sin. And he's called a complete wicked person for not having the fear of God in front of him, in front of his eyes. In other words, it doesn't give that person an excuse. That we're 100% granting. So maybe then I should be able to judge him. But we're going to actually see soon that no, it's still not an excuse to judge them. But nevertheless, we're sticking on a point over here that even somebody that has a very tough time still doesn't have an excuse. Because he should have controlled himself and ruled over this desire in his heart because of the fear of God who sees all of his actions. As we wrote earlier, I believe in chapter 12, that naturally by every competent human being's mind rules over the heart naturally. So there really is no excuse for anybody, because everyone naturally has control over their heart. Vihine. So now we're going to explain why, even though he doesn't have an excuse, somebody that is sinning he's doing something wrong. We're not denying that. But you don't have a right to judge him. And we're going to explain why. Why you're not any better than him. והנה באמת שהיא מלחמה גדולה ועצומה לשפוך היצר הבורח כאש להבה מפני פחד השם וכמו ניסיון ממש. And that is he's going to give a whole explanation so that we can understand why not, why you can't judge. Really, it is a very difficult war to break the inclination that is burning like a burning fire, because of the fear of Hashem. It is so difficult that it is literally like a test. Like God giving you a test, that is what that is. God giving you the evil inclination, and you have to overcome it because of recognizing God and being afraid of God. That is difficult. It's a test. It's a real test. And because it's so difficult, if it's not difficult for you, then that means that something's wrong. If you're just going through life, and even if you're a good person and you do good things, but you're not really fighting the evil inclination, that means that you're doing something wrong, because as we're going to explain why, actually, the reason. והילקח צריך כל אדם לפי מה שהוא מקומו מדרגתו בעבודת השם לשכון ולבחון בעצמו. So, because it's a big war, meaning it's difficult to overcome one's evil inclination, every person on their level, okay, one person can be on a lower or greater level than the other, must, in a level in serving God, okay, must evaluate himself. If he is serving God with such a big fight, in a way that he's really waging a war against the evil inclination. בחינת מלחמה עצומה כזו וניסיון כזה, בבחינת ועשה טוב. And a test like this, meaning that he is really doing he's really, overcoming the test that God is giving him. And we're talking about even somebody who is doing a good person. He's doing good things. But when it comes to the positive, when it comes to doing good, Kegon. So the battle that let's say that you are a good person. You're not doing anything wrong. But you are not waging war. You do not find yourself waging war against your evil inclination. That means that you're not overcoming the test that God has given you. And how do you see that? You don't see that in the negative because you're not doing anything wrong. You're not doing any evil. You see that in the positive. Are you doing enough good in this world? Are you doing enough positive things? Are you pushing yourself to be a better person? Kigon, for example, ba'avodat hatfila b'kavana, when it comes to praying with intention. Okay? That itself is something that you have to ask yourself. Am I pushing myself during my prayer to be focused on what I'm saying, on the words of the prayer? It's very easy to just go through the motions, say the words, and not focus. That's one example. To pour his soul in front of God with all of his might, literally, until the wringing out of the soul. And to fight with his body and his animal soul inside of him, which prevent this intention. To fight them with a great fight. So, well, I'll explain actually in a minute. And to crush them and to grind them like dust. Before the prayer, the morning prayer and the evening prayer, on a daily basis. I'm going to explain soon, just bear with me. And also in the time of the prayer to toil very much and labor in his soul and labor with his flesh, as we'll explain later on at length. So the question is really, am I using out all of my power, all of my mental capacity, all of my emotional capacity to truly overcome the laziness of my body and the foreign thoughts of my animal soul? Am I really winning the war against my inclination when I pray? Or am I losing the war against my inclination when I pray? Am I fighting with all of my might? If I'm just going through the motions and I'm not putting all my effort into my prayer, then I'm not praying hard enough. So one needs to truly judge themselves and see if they are putting enough effort into it. And then there's two components, and we're going to speak about this later on. So see, for sure, chapter 42, I believe from chapter 41, I think, till like 49, I believe. See those chapters when we're going to talk about things to think about before prayer and things to think about during prayer. Am I doing my best to really think about those things, and am I doing my best to focus? וכל שלא הגיע לידי מידה זו, להילחם עם גופו במלחמה עצומה כזו, and if I'm not doing my best, really judge yourself honestly, and I'm not reaching this war of fighting against my body, the laziness of my body, with a great fight like this, עדיין לא הגיע לבחינת וערך מלחמת היצר הבוער כאש להבה, ותניחנה ונשפך מפני פחד השם. Then I still haven't reached the level of a challenge of somebody that has a burning inclination, like a flaming fire, and his challenge is to subdue it and break it because of the fear of God. So basically, if I look at somebody else that's, let's say, less religious than me, for example, and I think about the fact that, hey, maybe he has a much tougher fight than I do. He has to deal, he has a big test from God. God gave this person a very strong inclination, a burning inclination for immoral things, for example. Me, I have a test. God gives me a test every day to pray with intention, with focus. If I'm not overcoming my challenge, then how can I be any better than that guy who's not overcoming his challenge? How am I any better than him? That's one example, prayer. Let's give another example. וכן בעניין עסק לימוד התורה, ללמוד הרבה יותר מחפצו ורצונו, לפי טיבו ורגילותו. על ידי מלחמה עצומה עם גופו. And so too when it comes to, guess what? Learning Torah. To learn way more than his desire, according to his nature and his norm, through a very strong fight with his body, right? Naturally, I can only learn, let's say, for example, 10 minutes a day, Torah. And if I don't fight my inclination, if I don't fight my nature, my impulses, and say, no, sit down, learn for much more than that, learn for an hour, not for 10 minutes, for an hour. And so I am not overcoming my challenge. God gave me a challenge, and I'm not overcoming it. I'm only overcoming it if I'm learning way more than I want to, and I'm accustomed to. And if so, I'm no better than some less religious guy who's not overcoming their challenge. כי הלומד מעט יותר מטיבו, הרי זה מלחמה קטנה בין הערך ודמיון, היא מלחמת היצר הבוער כאש, דמקרי רשע גמור אם אינו מנצח יצחו להיות נכרע ונשפך מפני השם. Because, as we're going to explain right now, the reason that I don't have a right to judge that person is because if I'm learning just a little bit more than I'm used to, let's say instead of 10 minutes, I'm used to 10 minutes, I learn for 15 minutes, that's a little bit more. That's a small fight against my evil inclination, my impulses. And it has no comparison to the great challenge and the fight of that guy, the less religious guy, with his inclination that is burning like fire, who would be called a wicked person, complete wicked person, if he doesn't conquer his inclination, making it subdued and broken in front of God. So, okay, yes, he's not doing the right thing. Again, we're not denying that. But am I any better than him? He has a way bigger challenge than me. I have no right to say that I'm better than him. Umali bechinat sur meira, umali bechinat va'aseh tov. Hakol hi mitzvat hamelech hakadosh yechid u'miyuchad baruch hu. What does it make a difference if the challenge is a challenge of turning away from evil, or the challenge is a challenge of doing positive things, of doing good? All of these challenges, whether it's the challenge of the less religious guy whose challenge is not doing evil things, like immoral things, for example, his challenge is no different than my challenge, let's say, of not learning more than I'm used to, or of not focusing in my prayer more than I'm used to. We both have a challenge that is equal because they are both the commandments of the King, the Holy King, who is one and united, blessed be He. They're both challenges given by God. God gave him a challenge, and God gave me a challenge. So, if he's not fulfilling his challenge, and I'm not fulfilling my challenge, then I'm not any better than him. That's for sure. וכן בשאר מצוות, ובפחת בדבח שבממון, כמו עבודת הצדקה וקהי גברה. And that's just two examples we gave, prayer and learning Torah. But every other mitzvah as well. You got to judge yourself. Hey, am I doing what's expected of me? And especially, what he says over here, is something that's monetary. Sometimes the hardest mitzvahs to fulfill are the ones that are the monetary mitzvahs. Like giving tzedakah, giving charity, and so on. Am I giving as much tzedakah as I should be? And if I'm not, then I'm certainly no better than somebody that's off doing immoral things. Because giving tzedakah and not doing immoral things are both commandments of Hashem. I'm not listening to Hashem. And he's not listening to Hashem, so I'm no better than him. ואפילו בבחינת סוך מרע, יכול כל איש משכיל למצוא בנפשו שאינו סך לגמרי מהרע בכל מכל כל. במקום שצריך למלחמה עצומה כערך הנזכוך לעיל. ואפילו פחות מערך הנזכוך לעיל. And that's doing good. Not overcoming the challenge of doing good things. But even when it comes to not doing evil things, every single person, even the most religious person, for example, when he does a little bit of introspect, when he's a little bit reflective, can find in himself that he does not turn away from evil completely and fully. When it comes to somewhere that he needs to wage a big battle against himself, against his impulses, like the battle that we mentioned earlier, and even a battle that is not so difficult. And we're going to give an example right now, that anybody can find in themselves that they're not doing what they should be. Kigon, for example, להפסיק באמצע שיחה נאה או סיפור בגנות חברו. ואפילו גנאי קטן וקל מאוד, אף שהוא אמת. Gossip. That's a great example that he gives over here. To stop speaking in the middle of a very pleasant conversation, or a story about the disgrace of somebody else. And even if it's just a very small and light disgrace, very small, even if it's true, ואפילו כדי לנקות עצמו, and even if it's just to make himself innocent from it. Make himself innocent from, let's say, judgment or whatever it is. So, am I overcoming the challenge of not gossiping? Or am I giving in to my impulses and am I gossiping? And if I am, then I'm no better than anybody that would be less religious than me, for example. And he explains over here. He gives a story. There's a story in the Gemara, in the Talmud, that the leader of the Jewish people at the time, whose name was Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, one time looked at a document. He didn't realize that it was a folded document. And he didn't see the date, because the date was in the fold. So he said this document is invalid. His son, Rabbi Shimon, said, no, my father, it's a folded document. So he looked, he saw the date, and he said, okay, fine. But then the father looked at his son disapprovingly, because folded documents were unacceptable. And he figured that his son wrote this unacceptable folded document. So the son, Rabbi Shimon, told his father, no, I didn't write the folded document. It was Yehuda the scribe who wrote the folded document. And what did his father tell him? He told him, distance yourself from evil talk, from Lashon Hara. That shows that even in a case where, first of all, Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi Huda Hanasi, he was a Torah scholar. He was a great man. And even he could find in himself that he wasn't doing something right. He wasn't turning away from evil. He was speaking gossip. And it was just a gossip to free himself, to make himself innocent. But nevertheless, he should not have spoken that gossip. Look over there. The Gemara is in the tractate of Bava Batra, the beginning of chapter 10 over there. And there's, for example, many instances, many things that are very common, that even the most religious people mess up in, do them, that they should not be doing. And that is general things, but specifically, I think the reason he highlights this, in my opinion, is because it's something that's so common. Every day, every minute, really. I mean, maybe every minute or whatever it is, but we have the opportunity to fulfill this, which is what? To sanctify yourself in something that is permissible to you. What does that mean? That means just because you're permitted to do something, it doesn't mean you should do it. Just because you're permitted to eat this delicious, fatty, kosher steak, it doesn't mean you should do it. Doing it would be giving in to your impulses. And saying, no, I'm not going to eat the steak, or at least I'm not going to eat it for the next 5 minutes, that is a mitzvah from the Torah. So that is another thing that one should judge themselves if they're really fulfilling that or not. As it says, he quotes the two verses, you shall be holy and sanctify yourselves. And also the words of our sages are stricter than the words of the Torah. So there's many requirements that are imposed upon us, not by the Torah, but by our sages. Our sages imposed upon us many things. And they happen to be sometimes more difficult to keep. So one should see if they are really fulfilling all of the laws that the sages imposed upon us. In fact, the laws that the sages imposed upon us are in a way more severe than the laws that the Torah imposes upon us. So you really need to judge yourself very, very well. It's just what happens naturally. All these things and similar are sins, as we call it, shadam dash be'ikavav, that someone just treads upon them with their ankles. They're very light sins. And not just that, but they also, that's number one, you just don't even think about them. But number two is that when somebody does something that's wrong again and again, they become permissible in their eyes. If someone, for example, breaks Shabbat over and over again, then Shabbat becomes permissible in their eyes. So it's very possible that somebody is doing something wrong and they don't even realize it. But truly, if he's a scholar, or as we'll put it in modern day language, ultra-orthodox, and he abides by the Torah of Hashem, and he desires to be close to Hashem, his sin is unbearably great, and his guilt is doubly, or in a multiplying way, large. Bema she'eino nilcham u'mitkaber al yitzcho be'erich u'bechinat milchama atzuma hanal. In this, that he is not fighting and overcoming his inclination on a great level of the great war that we mentioned before. So if somebody is just going through his life, I'm talking about now, quote unquote, very religious person, and they are not, they're after judging themselves, they see that they're not properly overcoming their evil inclination, then their sin and their guilt is far, far greater than that of a quote-unquote non-religious person who has a very, very difficult challenge, as we're about to say over here. Ma'ashmat kal shebekali miyoshvei kchanot הרחוקים מהשם ותורתו, ואין אשמתם גדולה כל כך במה שאינם כובשים יצחם הבורח כאש להבה. מפני פחד השם, המבין ומביט את כל מעשיהם. So, compared to, one who's very religious and is not really conquering his evil inclination, is way more guilty than the guilt of a religiously irreverent person who sits in the corners of the streets and is very far from Hashem and from His Torah. And their guilt is not so strong in the fact that they're not conquering their inclination that is burning like a fire, like a burning fire, because of the fear of God that understands and sees all of their actions. So them not overcoming their inclination is not so, it does not make them nearly as guilty. Compared to the guilt of someone who is very, very close to Hashem and to His Torah and to His service. So, sorry, before we continue. So, what do you see from there? That the greater you are, the more strictly you need to judge yourself. And, okay, let's say somebody who grew up in a non-religious family, he never grew up keeping Shabbat, he never grew up keeping kosher, for example, never kept any of these things. And you, who did grow up in a religious home, FFB, from birth, and you're doing mitzvahs, why do you get to take credit for what you're doing? Why are you any better than he is? Maybe the whole reason that you're doing it is just because you were brought up that way. As opposed to him, who never had the opportunity to do that. And if you're not doing the best of the best that you can to do what Hashem wants, then your guilt is far, far worse than his guilt, because he has a much harder time doing the right thing. And as the sages say regarding Acher, Acher refers to a sage by the name of Elisha ben Avuya, who I'm not going to go into his story. He has a very fascinating story. But to put it, long story short, he was an outstanding sage. And he knew a lot of Torah. He was one of the leading sages of his time. But he ended up going and doing evil things. And he dropped the Torah, dropped the mitzvahs, and so on. So his guilt was very, very great, because far greater than any other non-religious person, because he knew the right thing. He knew God's honor, as it says over here. And therefore, the sages of blessed memory said regarding ignorant people that their intentional sins, it is as if those sins are unwarranted. Meaning, the sins that they did on purpose, it's like they did them by mistake, because they didn't know any better, and they had a very hard time fulfilling the mitzvot. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.